panel discussion, so this will just be an open conversation. Any questions the audience has, any topics the speakers would like to develop further, and we'll go until a maximum of 5:30 or until no one wants to talk anymore.
For a
So you
microphone.
guys will have to just pass this.
Oh, I see. I guess there's a
back and
microphone.
forth. This is for the main. I'll let you hold it. And this is for the camera.
Oh, I see. That has the camera. I got it. So-
We'll decide afterwards if we actually say if
So-
it's recording or not.
So I have a quick question, but it's not going to be a question that I ask you. I want each of you to respond about what you thought about each other's talks.
Oh, dear. That'll take a while.
Do we have to say the truth, or?
It's a Catholic event, so I would think so, but that's up to you.
Yeah.
Confession is shortly.
Well, I'd be happy to go first. I would say I learned the most from your talk, because CRISPR has just not been, I just have read almost nothing about it. I don't know, I just didn't know much about it at all. So I would say in your talk, I learned like a ton. And because I was more familiar with the things you were talking about, I learned less, but I did learn a lot. And I thought both of them were very precise and informative and stuff. So for me—
But were they charming?
David, of course. So yeah, for me, I enjoy both talks where I know something, because for me it's interesting to see how someone else presents the material. And sometimes I can get ideas like, oh, well, I talk about this, but I see how she presented it. Well, that seems really like a good way to present it. But then I also like talks where it's brand new. The talks that are new, though, it's harder for me because, like in your talk, almost each slide had quite a bit of things I hadn't thought about at all. So, in terms of technology, so that was like, and I was trying to figure out like how these things work. Anyway, so it just caused more challenge for me. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot from all the talks. I'm familiar with all the issues to some extent, but I think particularly in the CRISPR talk and the talk on stem cells, there was a lot of the kind of detail on the scientific and the biological aspects that I'm not as well versed in. That I learned, and also I haven't really focused on either of those things research-wise, so just kind of helpful to get a sense of what's going on in terms of updated debates and clearer kind of state of the research right now and things like that. So I found that really, really helpful. And yeah, it was also kind of provocative to think about. I haven't really done direct work on just war theory. But yeah, it is something that gets talked about now, particularly in terms of, not just from Cardinal McElroy's talk, but in general, I think people sometimes wonder, are we in a new moment because perhaps of things like the prospect of nuclear warfare and the sorts of weapons that in some ways can't distinguish appropriately between competence and non-competence. How does that change things? And so anyway, it raised a lot of interesting questions for me as well.
Yeah, I also enjoyed all the talks. It was a great group of speakers. And I learned a lot from Chris's talk. It was wonderful. Again, like Melissa, just war theory isn't in my wheelhouse normally, so hearing what's going on at the moment in the public conversation was just really helpful, and your response to it was great, and just the closely reasoned argument. Your talk was also great. I'm more familiar with your writings a lot, so I kind of knew your argument, but seeing you present it was great. I really enjoyed, being at the same institution, you kind of get to know people. And similarly, even though I've done a lot of work on stem cells, you presented a lot of other kinds of research on it that I hadn't seen, and I especially enjoyed seeing your comments on the synthetic embryos, which I think is an emerging issue that's going to become more important as I see it. That those and organoids and other things are going to be important places for moral discernment, and so hearing like a first take on those was really helpful for my own thought.
Well, Elaine. the rest of you. I am extremely ignorant about most of the topics that were presented today, with the exception of CRISPR. I actually feel like I know most, not much about that. But I really appreciated all three of your talks for the way that you contextualize the discussion of your specific topics, particularly you, in terms of moral agency and choice, right? That helping frame this not simply as a matter of fact or as a matter of some sort of technological analysis, but both for the just war, for CRISPR and thinking about the implications of it, and for vaccines and cooperation with people. It was really helpful for me to have that context. For our virtual talk, what I loved about this was, I don't know, the courage of someone who could take such a complicated topic and bring it to us in a way that tried to be fair and balanced without simplifying the medical issues, because leading in with the compassion, the necessity to be with people, and yet making it so clear how this is not necessarily in the best interest of the patients was, I thought, a very, very valuable and experience-informed perspective.
Right.
In all of your talks, from my perspective, I really appreciated the various different technical disciplines that were represented in these discussions. I mean, we've had a lot of talk, at least within our society, about nuclear weapons. I mean, but that's what would you expect in Los Alamos. Some of these other issues, and even ones that aren't even here related to information technology and all, you know, there are a lot of moral considerations. I guess I would ask anyone who would like to respond. Morality is seen on an individual scale, right? And then it translates to a societal scale, at which point you codify your beliefs in certain what's right and what's wrong, and then you establish penalties for what's right. But at the individual level, you make a decision that's moral or not, and you act on it. But it changes as you go up the number of folks. You know, you get what I'm saying? I mean, you could have a compact. The three of us agree that, well, abortion, we will not do abortion. You know, but when you get a secular society as big as ours, you know, it's a much more difficult prospect to get everybody's consensus on how we see moral issues. How do you see that in your different fields? You know, at what point is, you know, I will just stop there because it's just a question that came up, because a lot of these things that you were talking about, there's a very important individual moral decision that somebody has to make. But
I'll take a pass at it. In my field, I think I'm really guided by the concept of persuasion. You know, that I don't believe there are multiple correct answers, although people can feel that there are. And I think it's important for us to engage in dialogue with people and try to help them answer the question that was put very clearly in the gender dysphoria lecture. What is in the best interest of the individuals who are suffering? I mean, I encounter this much more frequently in the context of abortion, but I think, and it's a tough question to answer for the same reasons. It's very, very hard to do objective research. We can't randomly assign people to the abortive group and the non-abortive group. So it's hard to get good data on it. It's hard to get money to do these kinds of studies. But everyone knows this. If you ask them, what is really in the best interest of the woman? What would help her? What would give her the most peace? What would give her the most strength? And the more you talk about that, the more well, I would personally be opposed, but I'm not going to tell somebody else what to do, evaporates. Because you can look at them and say, oh, you know this is not in her best interest, but you're going to support it anyway. You're going to allow her to harm herself. And that can become the basis for a mutual understanding.
I mean, I think using persuasion is very important and finding those common threads of argument. And I think we can frequently separate off the situation of like the individual moral choice and social roles, but we get it's social kind of setting. But in a lot of technologies, which are doing the ethics of technology, these things are going to be implemented society-wide, and that's the structure of society, how it's structured by the technologies, by social media, by what genetics are possible, by what is being offered, will feed back on individual moral decisions. So, I mean, I think sometimes you can separate them too much, and there's a lot of kind of play between the role of kind of legal and social frameworks and technological guidelines and individual moral choice. But how do you do this practically when having these conversations? I mean, sometimes it depends on what audience you're talking to. Like, I teach moral theology, I'm teaching seminarians, I'm having conversations with various theologians, and I'm going to use a lot of different kinds of frameworks about the Imago Dei and these kinds of things in those conversations. But that doesn't mean that some of those ideas can't be also very fruitfully translated into kind of frameworks that people who don't share the Catholic faith can recognize, right? So in the CRISPR things, a lot of what I was talking about, like concerns over enhancement, concerns over germline genetic engineering, like these are not restricted to kind of Catholic theology. I mean, these are widely shared, and it's not that everyone agrees and there's disputes, but you can find allies and conversation partners and ways to have those conversations fairly easily, I found.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot in your question. So, I mean, I'll focus on one point that I think was implicit in your question, which was how do you kind of take ethical principles in a pluralistic society where people have very different moral beliefs about things and bring it to the societal level, particularly to the level of laws and so on, right? And there are a lot of people who just say, well, given pluralism and diversity of views, we have to take, I don't know, the most unrestrictive position on issues like abortion or something like that, right? But I think in part that's a cop-out, right? Because every law expresses and codifies some moral principle, and it's either going to be a correct principle or an incorrect principle. So you can't get around the idea of legislating morality. Every law legislates morality, right? And then the question is just, well, how controversial is the moral claim that you're legislating? So very few people are going to object to outlawing murder of born human beings, right? And there are lots of things about which there is widespread agreement now. But as I always point out to my students, there are some things about which there is widespread agreement now that there was incredibly widespread disagreement about just a century or two ago. I mean, I always bring up the idea of slavery, and because if I give them a statement like, racism is wrong or slavery is wrong, they're going to say, oh, that's an objective statement, that's not a controversial statement. And I said, okay, now what about the phrase abortion is wrong? And they said, oh no, that's a relative, subjective statement. And I said, look, they're the same kind of statement. It's just a matter of whether as a society we've come to a consensus on this. But we didn't have a consensus about slavery, 100, 150 years ago at all, right? And so, and there might have been people who thought that what abolitionists were saying about the wrongness of slavery in the early 1800s was speech that was offensive and beyond the pale, right? Just as some people think about speech about abortion being wrong as being offensive somehow, right? And so I think it's helpful to contextualize these things and say, no, we actually, nobody really thinks that morality is just a matter of subjective opinions and so on. It's just that they think that the issues about which there's controversy somehow it makes it subjective, but it doesn't. And so when it comes to also the societal level, well, you have to then try to figure out, well, what is the correct answer, right, for your legislation. And then there's also the question in terms of laws about, well, where are people and what can be reasonably legislated given the current state of willingness of the population to accept that legislation. I mean, this is something that even Aquinas talks about in terms of the correct understanding of tolerance, that you can't prohibit every vice in law. And part of what a prudent legislator needs to determine is what, even if you're dealing with grave moral evils, to what extent will the population be able and willing to kind of accept and recognize the justice of the law and follow it. So I think, you know, there's room for incrementalism on a lot of issues, precisely because you have to bring people along, right? And so you need to persuade, and incremental laws can help to persuade because laws themselves are teachers. So if you go for, say, on abortion, right, laws that are better than the current ones, even if not perfect, that helps to show people, oh, the world didn't fall down, right? And then, you know, accompany those with better policies to help women and address the underlying causes of abortion. And then that paves the way for people to be willing to accept laws that are even more just, and so on. So that's just one example.
I'm not sure if I can add anything to these three fantastic contributions. I'll just add something about what the law shouldn't do, at least on my view. I think there is a realm of non-legal, merely private moral action. So I'm thinking of things, for instance, I call my mother every Sunday. Now, why do I do that? Just because she said she wanted me to call her more often. So I said, okay, I'll call her every Sunday, and she likes it. Now, would I want a law that says everyone in the United States needs to call their mother every Sunday? Well, no. Right? Maybe your mother's crazy and you have to hide from her because she's tracking you down for whatever, and you can never. I mean, I don't know your situation with your mother. So there's a realm, in other words, I think where law ought not to interfere. So one of them would be things like this. Another one for me is religious practice. So in other words, I do not want, even though I personally go to Mass every Sunday, I do not want a law saying, even if the whole country were Catholic, even if, you know, everyone was a devout Catholic, I would not want a law that said everyone in the United States needs to go to Mass every Sunday, otherwise they're going to get, you know, thrown in jail or anything like that. So I think the law is important, but I think there's this sphere of personal action that actually is extremely important. And in terms of our flourishing, I would say it's actually more important. I'm going to forget who said this, I think it was Boswell, how little, I can't remember the quotation. It's basically about how much of our suffering laws don't really, and how much of our happiness laws don't really interfere with. In other words, much of our flourishing is, regardless of who the king is or what the law is, it has to do with our personal activities. And so even if you were in a very unjust society, usually you can find some degree, at least, of personal flourishing by having good friendships, by trying to be a good son, daughter, husband, wife, grandfather, grandmother, you know, by being a good neighbor, by loving God. So in a way, I think sometimes there can be an overemphasis on law, as if law is going to rescue us. If we just got the right people in Washington, well, man, everything would be solved and every problem taken away. I think that's really naive. If I could choose either to have perfect laws or a virtuous people, I would choose a virtuous people for sure. Because you can have whatever law you want on the books, but if people, you know, you need law enforcement to be virtuous, you need, you know, in a way, the law is a teacher, but it is a teacher that requires a lot of human virtue to actually work.
Okay,
So in a way, I think that virtue is more important.
I have to push back on that a tiny
Yeah,
bit.
good.
Because, not because I disagree with anything you said, but because I think there's a few things left out. One, the law should not preclude you from making personal moral choices. A law that says, I must pay for people's abortions is an evil law. And in addition, the law has a legitimate role in providing space for people to make good choices. You know, I would be very much in favor of a law that says businesses have to be closed on Sundays so that Chris can call his mother and other people can spend time chatting with their children and, you know, hanging out and being better humans. However they choose to do that. So I think creating space for individual moral choices and also not forcing the hand of people to make choices they might consider to be immoral is an important function of the law. I did have a question for you, if it's okay, or should we go with the audience?
This topic?
I wanted to make a literary point.
Okay.
And ask the question maybe
All right, go ahead.
when the time is right. I think it was like Samuel Johnson, but it might have been Alexander Pope. I think what you're thinking about, Chris, is how small of all the human heart, how how small of all that human hearts endure, that part that kings were laws, and laws were kings.
That is exactly what I was thinking. I just wrote it down here. That's exactly what I was thinking.
So you had a question?
Yeah, no, thank you. My mind lets go 1,000 things, and that's one of them.
You're allowed to ask each other questions.
Oh, I was going to ask a follow-up question. I was intrigued by the distinction, as many people in the CRISPR discussions make, between enhancement and therapies or cures. But there are lots of, nature is a cruel experimenter. I mean, we have a huge number of naturally occurring genetic variants that do confer superior performance on biological parameters. I think you were thinking of the cholesterol one.
Yeah.
And that's one that's often raised. So there's a variant of an enzyme involved in cholesterol metabolism that actually protects you from heart attacks. It's naturally occurring. It's been around for a long time. It exists in a lot of people, but not everybody. Would it be enhancement to swap out, my weak copy of that enzyme for a superior one that's given to us by nature?
I think I would argue that it would probably be an enhancement to be focusing on doing a genetic shifts. But my bigger point would be that the gains you get from these are very marginal from the risk that you would run from any kind of genetic intervention, the cost of those genetic interventions.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I don't think the cost of genetic interventions are going to go down that much, because it's always going to need a lot of human professionals involved in it. So yeah, and part of my work right now is just focused on how much of our society and our medicine is now focused on prevention, and there's a lot of discussion of how that's leading us to overdiagnosis and overtreatment, overspending on fairly marginal gains in life expectancy.
Right, but let's do a thought experiment. I mean, what if there was a naturally occurring variation on telomerase or something that could extend the lifespan by 50 years with good health? So that's not a trivial gain. And let's say that this happens, we encounter this variation, this naturally occurring mutation, at a time when the risks for genome engineering have been minimized. So that's now pretty much like getting a tooth pulled or something. There's always a risk for any kind of procedure.
Yeah.
The cost financially may not come down, but if the benefit is high, the personal risk is low, is having an enhanced telomerase activity that's going to buy you 50 years an enhancement?
So this gets into the broader questions about life extension and the focus on life extension as an ideal, right? And I think there are some, and so there are people who want to invest a ton of money into like really hunting down everything we can do to extend life, hopefully to getting us to like negligible senescence, right? So that you could just live an extended period of life. My concern with all of those kinds of uses of science, right, that don't address a concrete human suffering that's existing right now, is that we're not focused on the right things. That like those dreams, those ideals of having those things are going to distract us from curing the kind of misery we can in the world, and frequently they will tempt us to the sorts of to putting our end in the wrong places, right? Instead of trying to make the most of our life at this moment, which will require a great deal of risk to life, a great deal of kind of abnegation, things like that. It makes us think about trying to live as long as possible, trying to maximize and do those kinds of extension. I think medicine, when it puts its aims there, it can lead to some really problematic kind of effects on character, like a misunderstanding of the aim of life.
Why do you assume everyone would want to live another 50 years?
Okay, but
Other
I
topics?
guess we're maybe focusing on too much detail of the example I raised. I mean, what if it was a variant that protected you from senility? What if it was a variant that protected you from cancer? What if it was a variant that protected you from dementia, many other debilitating conditions that wouldn't necessarily be outside the range of relieving human suffering, which is the proper act of medicine. I guess I just see the distinction between enhancement and therapy as a much blurrier distinction.
I think there are places where it is blurry, and I think I said that, but I think there are also some clear distinctions between enhancement and therapy. I mean, I think methodologically I have a problem with, I'm not a philosopher. I don't like thought experiments. I'm married to an anthropologist, so I like thick description, right? And I think a lot of the ethical problems that we face come out in that thick description, right? When you're talking about wars, you can abstractly think about a kind of ideal war that would be good, but it's much more helpful to think about World War II or Ukraine and the details, and that I think is helpful for the moral kind of reflection. And so this is where I would say I would want to know much more of the details of what the idea was that was going to be used for enhancement before saying that it was okay.
It sounds like you would also want to have a much more concrete grasp of what the risks are, the
That's exactly right.
consequences
Yeah.
would be before going down that road.
Yeah.
George?
So this is kind of an open question, but I was wondering if each of you might be able to provide a little bit of comment on any issues at the intersection of science and ethics that were not raised in today's discussions, so either of the presentations, but that you think could use a little more emphasis, maybe on the global scale, or maybe something that's more particular to your discipline that you think would be interesting to bring up as another interesting topic.
Go to the June conference.
One thing that I think would be interesting to address is how conscience protections for healthcare workers actually advance scientific discoveries. So I'm thinking here about a number of areas. One of them is people in reproductive medicine who conscientiously objected to IVF. They went on to develop nanotechnology. And people who conscientiously object to physician-assisted suicide are also people that are developing advances in palliation. Another example would be people who would conscientiously object to so-called gender-affirming care. I don't like that term, but that's a term that's been used. If their energies, time, resources were put rather to alleviating the psychological suffering that the person is involved with, the outcomes may be much, much better. But if there's no room in the medical profession for conscientious objection, basically the kinds of innovations that arise just won't be made. To use one more example, there are some people who object to abortion, and there's some people who object to using methotrexate to treat ectopic pregnancy. Now, I'm skeptical that that's morally wrong, but let's take the person who in conscience thinks they can't do that. Well, it might be possible, at least theoretically, to remove the embryo from the fallopian tube and implant it in the uterus. And apparently there's been 2 cases in the past where this has been done that have led to live birth. Now, there's some controversy about that because it could be a case of double pregnancy where there was a tubal pregnancy and then also a uterine pregnancy. But if it was, it's possible, I guess, that you could develop a kind of technique that would remove the embryo from the fallopian tube and then have it in the uterus, and then that would, obviously give the child a chance to live. So anyway, I think that it's important to highlight the link basically between innovation and protection of conscience rights.
Yeah, I was going to say something about conscience as well. So I agree that I think that's, on all angles of that topic, I think are really important and relevant right now, although that's a particularly interesting and original one, right, to talk about how this actually drives innovation in a variety of ways. But another thing that I think is important is thinking a bit more about how the scope and understanding of the goals of the medical profession have changed over the past half century or a bit more. And the Maureen's comment about medicine being aimed at ending suffering, and I don't want to pick on you about this, just brought this to my head because I immediately thought to myself, it's not the goal of medicine to end all human suffering. That's like this huge Promethean, completely, it's just not possible, right? So, but I think what has happened is that this has become, in some people's minds, the goal of medicine, end all suffering, right? And so, and this has taken away from the traditional understanding of medicine that gives it unity as a profession, which is that it's aimed at the restoration or maintenance of health, understood as the well-working of the body as a whole, and that gives a sense of limit and a recognition also of the limited scope of what a doctor should be expected to do. I think it's also really important for correctly understanding conscience in the medical context, because often those who are opposed to rights of conscientious objection will portray conscientious objection as this really idiosyncratic private thing that has nothing to do with kind of conscientious clinical judgment on the part of the healthcare professional, which to a large extent, the most typical cases of conscientious objection are really cases in which the physician or other healthcare professional is refusing to do something that's outside the scope of medicine. I mean, birth control is not curing any disease. In fact, it's rendering a healthy body unhealthy, right? In the service of certain lifestyle choices and so on, right? But it's really a technical manipulation. It's not aimed at health. It's outside the traditional goals of medicine. The same with, euthanasia or assisted suicide, right? It's not restoring health. The same with, these hormonal and surgical interventions for gender dysphoria. They're not restoring health. They're not addressing underlying causes. The same with IVF. It's a workaround. It doesn't restore health. And it just actually creates risks to health for both women and child instead of addressing and identifying first and then addressing the underlying issues. So I do think, and actually I think there's a connection here as well to the opioid crisis. There's a very interesting documentary that brought this out, but it came in the context of expanding the scope of medicine to eliminate all pain. Instead of recognizing that pain is a symptom, and the goal of medicine is to address the underlying cause of the pain and restore health to the extent possible. It's not simply, it really can't be the goal to eliminate all pain, right? And it's in this idea of thinking about pain as this separate thing that needs to be treated independently of any underlying malady that led to the sense that you should just keep prescribing pills despite the risks to actual health, right? So anyway, that's a kind of set of things that all relate to really kind of properly understanding the scope of medicine.
I mean, there's a lot of issues that one could bring up, and I think both of these are really important. I think if I was going to say something about the science and ethics and theology and kind of those intersections, I would want to look at the reproducibility crisis, and just looking at a lot of the literature, the medical literature is what I'm most in. You just look at papers and it's like, how did this get published? How did these statistics get done? And then, other ones you hear in ex post facto about how bad the data was. And so I think there's an important place for looking at what are the problems that are going on in the structures of science right now. And that could be ideology, as we heard, or it could be problems of kind of corporate influence or ambition in the career path. Like what's going on right now? Because I think this affects like the scientific vocation and the virtues of the scientists at a very deep level.
Well, I'm going to say what they all said. Plus, I think a really pressing ethical issue right now that is not getting the attention it deserves is equitable access to.
I'm sorry.
Equitable access to healthcare. Where do we put our money? Why do we put it where we do? And who gets it and who doesn't? I think related to that, and this is a naughty one. I'm willing to take the tomatoes thrown at me, but the role of genetically modified organisms in alleviating food insecurity and starvation. think there's coming from a very well-fed and overweight Western population, most of us tend to see this as, oh, it's just bad. And yet there's a lack of, well, there's actually some fairly good science that would argue against that. And we're not having enough of a debate about what's the alternative. I mean, I really liked the notion of what's the alternative to a just war analysis that Chris put forward, because nothing ever happens in a vacuum. And so the appropriate roles of genetically modified crops and perhaps even animals for the sake of alleviating starvation worldwide, I think is an important ethical and scientific interface that could deserve some more attention.
Well, I think you had your hand up.
Yes.
And then I'll go to you, Steve. I think those will be our last two conversation topics.
I think Paul first mentioned this, but I think a lot of you touched upon it in the recent thread here about the precautionary principle, about the alternatives, about adopting new technologies. Do we say yes or do we say no? And I think of an example from the 50s. Admiral Rickover was creating the nuclear navy, and he insisted on a very stringent radiation dose standard for the sailors. He said no sailor on a nuclear sub will receive more radiation on the shore. And he got pushback. Remember, people said, oh no, submarine's too heavy, blah, blah, blah. And he held to that. And I think that was a good example. I mean, he's a virtual dictator in his feet, but at the same time, he kind of made the right choice. But there's all these conflicts and trade-offs that we have to manage, and of a future that we can't predict versus holding things back. Sense of omission, sense of commission in the world of technology. Do you all have any thoughts about it? I know it's a very broad subject, but it's something we need to ponder as scientists and engineers, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think in the context of today's world, where if it can be done, it will be done, and it will also get me tenure. I think if anything, we need to be people who dig our heels in a little bit and try to resist things. I mean, when I look at the well-intentioned, but I think mistaken objection many people had to the COVID vaccines because they were based on the new technology, the RNA-based vaccination technology, their intuition was in the right direction in some ways. That this is a brand new thing, it's being foisted on us by mandate. We don't have any idea what's going to happen. I think a better effort to educate those people might have changed those things, but I think that their intuition was, in some ways, a corrective to the if it can be done, it will be done mentality.
I have to agree with the kind of that there's so much push to just develop the new technology, move fast and break things today that, yeah, standing in the way, I mean, even just asking questions and slowing things down is very valuable. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean you put a full stop, and after a little bit of discussion, you can maybe decide to move forward with kind of limited radiation doses. But yeah, I'm not as much concerned that we're going to do sins of omission with implementing new technologies. We're much more likely to be negligent in them.
Yeah.
And create Frankenstein.
So, on the question of enhancement versus therapy, that was the distinction, is that right?
Yes.
You have the correct distinction.
Yes.
So, I have a question. So, one is not saying that enhancements are intrinsically acting to enhance some power we have. Because actually athletes, they go into rigorous training and so on to enhance their skills beyond what they would otherwise be. It must be that the question, it must be, I would think, that if you're going to do some enhancement pharmacologically or somatic genetic manipulation or in some other way, it's a potential question of risks and benefits and costs and so on, right? I mean, it's not that say genetic enhancements would be per se immoral because they're enhancement, right? Because the risks and there are countervailing factors that might make it a bad thing to do. Is that the way I'm just as mostly
I think, no one has said intrinsically evil, but I read Dignitas Personae as warning us against it, any kind of enhancement in a very strong way, which would be a clear enhancement, in a strong way, because frequently you're using biotechnological ends towards, you're using biotechnology in ways that are kind of emphasizing one aspect of humanity in problematic ways. So take athletics, right? So, I mean, if you're doing genetic change, if you're doing steroids, if you're devoting everything to competitive success, right? You're getting into this positional success. I think there's a step to think, what are we doing with athletics right there at that point, right? And if you're thinking about trying to transform your children so they do better in school, like, the people who give their kids without ADHD Ritalin to kind of do better with tests, right, to enhance in that way, they're missing the point of education, right? And they're just about competitive success rather than wisdom. And I think that is what the warning, where a lot of people are concerned about enhancement. It's about the risks in some way, but it's more about the risk to our collective understanding of what are the valuable ends of human life. And a lot of times we're using these enhancements in problematic ways.
Yeah. As I said, I think the distinction between enhancement and therapy is very, very complicated. And I think that it admits of many degrees. Okay, a lot of people will argue that perfection of a natural function, I mean, your eyeglasses are an enhancement, and the counter to that would be, well, yes, but sight is a natural human function, and so simply perfecting a natural function is not an enhancement, it's a restoration of natural function. But you can take that one step further. Okay, if we found a way to pack your fovea full of more, 5 times as many cones as it currently has, your visual acuity would be far better. You would have the acuity of an eagle. You could see things at a mile away and, read the text on those posters back there. Okay, so would that be a perfection of a natural function or not? And I think there's legitimate argument, especially when you contrast it to something completely futuristic in science fiction. What if I genetically engineered people to have their skin express the major components of photosynthetic biochemical chain, so that they could manufacture their own food from sunlight? Okay, that would be cool. I would love to do that. but clearly that would be introducing a brand new function into humans that is in no way bearing upon their nature. Right? So I think the enhancement question really turns on what is human nature. In what way are we made in the image and likeness of God? And he gave us dominion not just over the world, but over ourselves. And lots of human interventions across the course of history have, in fact, radically altered, human functions that were considered to be natural. It was natural for people to die at age 35. It was natural for 40% of women and children to die in childbirth. Those were all natural things that naturally happened. But medicine and nutrition and sanitation have impacted those things. So I think part of your question as to what is enhancement intrinsically wrong would turn on what your definition of enhancement is.
That provocative question, I think, you get a final comment?
No.
Okay. I think we'll have to bring the conference to a close. So thank you for this discussion. Thank you all for making your journeys here and preparing these outstanding talks for us. I want to thank Steve Barr for supporting this event, for the John Templeton Foundation for supporting you, the SES, to support this event, and for putting together our lineup of speakers, actually. This was mostly Steve's idea. I want to thank my fellow board members for helping with all the logistics that made this possible. I forgot to thank the Boy Scout troop members who were here earlier, the Scout troop members who were here earlier helping us.
And we thank you, Chris.
Thanks.